All right, happy Sabbath, everybody. I want to welcome you all to our Med Missionary Sabbath podcast. And as many of you know, we are here every Saturday afternoon at 3 p.m. Pacific time. And we like to share about topics that we think that people who are really interested in studying the Bible, people who really believe that Jesus is coming soon, that you would be interested in. And today we are sharing about a subject that some of you might find to be a little bit surprising. But I think that it's a subject that it's important to talk about. And that is the subject of abortions. And the reason that I think that it's important to talk about is that, when I was in high school at a Christian high school, that I had a certain understanding of the subject of abortion that I think about much differently today. And I think that there are many young people who are being uh, who are being shaped to think a certain way about a lot of important subjects that are very spiritual and that have moral implications, and they're being shaped to think a certain way based upon politics and culture. And so we want to maybe talk about it today from a different perspective, and that would be from the perspective of people who believe in the subject of creation versus evolution, right and wrong in terms of what does the Bible have to say. And to do that, I have a special guest speaker, and her name is Pamela Acker. She is a biologist, and it's, Pamela, we don't have that many non-Seventh-day Adventists on our program. And so I appreciate you being here. And one of the reasons that I wanted to ask Pamela to be here is because I know, Pamela, that in your journey as a biologist and as someone who is interested in the subject of abortion, you didn't come to the conclusions that you have very lightly. It was something that you had to think about very much every step along the way. And so I'm going to read your background to people. And let's see. Let's see here. Okay, so Pamela Acker holds a Master in Science degree in biology from the Catholic University of America. She has taught science in a variety of settings, from middle school to college, since 2008. Prior to working as a teacher, Pamela was involved in biological research as a whole genome library maker at the Genome Sequencing Center at Washington University in St. Louis. She has also conducted research in vaccine delivery using T4 bacteriophage nanoparticles, and was briefly involved in researching novel gene regulation mechanisms in C. elegans. So, Pamela, welcome to Med Missionary. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me, especially since I'm one of your very few not Seventh-day Adventist speakers to come on. I'm very honored. And I'm also very impressed that you got through the entire introduction without mispronouncing any of the scientific words. That almost never happens.
Oh, really?
Usually people trip on bacteriophage and occasionally on C. elegans as well. So
Well, it is kind of my background. Now I do mostly just surgery, and so I don't have to deal with
okay,
of words and this kind of thing. But there was a period
sure.
of time that I had to study quite a bit of biology and that type of thing. So I guess it's coming in handy now a little
Well,
bit.
very good, very good.
So if you could tell just a little bit more about yourself growing up. I was reading through your book, and I'll just
Mhm.
let people know that Pamela has written a book called, I'm going to see if I could bring it in, Vaccination, A Catholic Perspective. And so we're going to talk about this from the perspective of you as a biologist, you as a Catholic, and you as your journey of a scientist, a Catholic scientist, and someone who
Sure.
believes in a biblical perspective on this. And so maybe you could just start out with how you started out on this journey of being interested in healthcare at such a young age.
Sure, sure. So, from my story, but I guess the audience doesn't necessarily know that I started to be interested in vaccines in high school. So as a 16, 17, 18-year-old, I was interested in genetics and I was interested in vaccine development. And I was really interested in putting the two of those things together. And that led to some very providential background as we're coming into an era where we're using all kinds of vaccines that do involve genetic manipulation of organisms. So it's funny that I've kind of been following that from the very beginning. So I got interested in all of this, particularly because my mom gave me, I was homeschooled in high school. So my mom gave me a book called Plants, Genes, and Agriculture by Martin J. Crispiels to read as my senior science, because I'd already finished all of the science that you would normally do in high school. And she said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I like plants and I like genetics. So something about plant genetics, let's do that. And this particular book talked about a project that was being developed at that time. And now this was in 1999. So in the textbook, usually the science in the textbook's about 10 years old. So this kind of goes all the way back to the late 80s. And most people don't realize this, but they were trying to develop edible vaccines. So they were trying to take plants and genetically engineer them to create vaccine antigens. And then you could eat that plant. So say you could eat a banana and you'd be vaccinated for smallpox, or maybe something more relevant like typhoid. So I thought that was a great idea because I hated needles. I thought growing plants was really cool, and I thought genetic engineering was really cool. And I still hate needles and I still love plants, but I'm not so much into genetic engineering anymore because I don't think it really fits with the biblical worldview. And that's one of the conversions I experienced later in life was coming to understand that I had previously kind of treated all living things as though they were some sort of cosmic accident, so that they developed through the accumulation of mistakes, through the accumulation of mutation over millions of years. I just kind of bought the whole evolutionary narrative. And it wasn't until I met my boss, who I currently work for, Mr. Hugh Owen of the Kolbe Center for the Study of Creation, whose mission is to re-evangelize Catholics about the first 13 or so chapters of Genesis. That God really did create the world the way he said he did, that there really was an historic flood, that we really can believe God from the very beginning of his word. That then I was able to kind of think, well, maybe there's some tension here between those two worldviews, right? There's tension between the idea that God created the world the way he said he did and the idea that it evolved. And so through a lot of study and prayer over the next 3 or 4 years, I looked at a lot of the supposed scientific evidence for evolution and really just came to find that it was not nearly as impressive as I had been led to believe. So there really wasn't a reason to abandon the traditional understanding of the faith. So that's kind of where sort of those two different things came from, and they met really. I started working for the Kolbe Center in 2019, so just before COVID happened. 2019 or 20 no, it was 2019, because I fell and I broke my ankle and I never really got better. And so I lost the regular job that I had. And at that point, I called up Mr. Owen and I said, you wanted me to take a look at vaccines a long time ago. And so to kind of backtrack a little bit, I had studied because I was interested in vaccines and I was interested in human health. And I really kind of bought the idea that vaccines are totally safe and effective. And this is how we really should help keep people safe, especially in third world countries. And again, this was where growing a banana and getting vaccinated for typhoid was a great idea, because you could just grow it right on site and it'd be great. You could just vaccinate people right there. And so I started a PhD program at Catholic U. And as you mentioned earlier, I only have my master's, but I only have my master's because I was working on an HIV project for an HIV vaccine, and they started using aborted fetal cells in the laboratory. So
Right.
I had known about aborted fetal cells being used in vaccines back in the 1990s, the late 1990s. And this information came out on a website called Children of God for Life. They started publishing all the data that was related to the use of these fetal cell lines in the MMR vaccine and the chickenpox vaccine, although that wasn't available at that time. But or was just beginning to be available. I don't remember exactly when the chickenpox came into approval, but and hepatitis A, some of the other ones that are commonly given to children. And so the genetic engineering of edible vaccines was a great idea as well to eliminate that connection between abortion and vaccines, because I had always been pro-life. I love babies, like I can't help it. But I love mothers too. And there's nothing really as beautiful on a natural level as that connection that a mother has with her baby, and watching a mother with her baby, or just holding a sleeping baby. And so it always struck me, even as a kid, that like, well, we can't just kill babies. Like, they're beautiful. They're people. We can't do that. So I'd always been motivated to really to help parents who just were in kind of agony about this. Like, I don't want to participate with abortion. I don't believe in abortion, but I don't want my kid to get a really bad disease. So I feel like I have to give them these vaccines that are connected to abortion. So kind of weaving in and out of my whole history here, but basically when I stopped working for the Catholic University of America because of the aborted fetal cells, I got involved with the Kolbe Center, and Mr. Owen knew that I was a vaccine researcher in my past life, and so he said, I want you to take a look at this information I found about vaccines. I'm kind of questioning some things about the safety, about the efficacy, of all these things. And then I called him up then in 2019 and said, I'm finally ready to take a look at that for you, because I don't have anything else to do right now. And that's what led
That's
to that book
incredible.
that was published in the December of 2020.
So maybe I should kind of summarize for people who might not know you and the Colby Institute and this kind of thing.
Sure.
So you're somebody who in high school got interested in the subject of vaccines and you were very interested in typical evolutionary science and
Hmm.
physics and that kind of thing. You started
Yeah.
getting interested. You were interested in vaccine production, but you weren't getting that much into the actual vaccine science of it because you had known that most of the vaccines were using aborted fetal cells and you weren't interested in doing that.
Yeah. So I was interested in developing an alternative to that. And that's why I went to graduate school in 2010. So
So
that's the part I didn't make super clear.
in
But
2010, when you went to graduate school and you started working with vaccines and you started working on the HIV project that you were working with,
mhm.
did you not know when you first started that project that it was using fetal cells
I
until?
didn't know that. No, no. When I went into the laboratory, we were working on anthrax and plague vaccines. And I
Mhm.
was actually super excited about that because my dad was in the military. And, as a former military brat, especially going through, 9/11 and all that, I was really interested in combating bioterrorism. So with anthrax and plague, because both of those are caused by bacteria, you can work completely independently of cell systems. So the viruses that end up being grown, or the vaccines that end up being grown in human cells or other cell lines, are ones that are virus based. So if we were making a bacterial vaccine, then there was going to be no connection with human cells at all. And so I was very excited about that. And then when I got accepted into the lab, they put me on the HIV project. So that's a virus, and I didn't think about it that the same way that I think about it now. It didn't raise a red flag for me in that way of like, oh, this is going to be in a cell line. I need to be really careful about it. I just paid attention to my part of the project. So I was supposed to so we were taking a virus, which is the T4 bacteriophage that you mentioned earlier. And we were basically going to take the capsule of that virus, the outside of that virus. We were going to empty all of its normal contents out, and we were going to put things on the outside so that it looked like a different virus, and then you could use it as a vaccine. So we were gonna basically, literally, we called it decorating the capsid, putting all these different antigen proteins on it to make it a vaccine. But I was supposed to put a protein on it that targeted it to a specific immune cell, so that it get taken up and would be more likely to have an immune response. So I was working with Chinese hamster ovary cells, which is a perfectly ethical cell line, a mouse cell line, and then a human cancer cell line. So when a cancer cell line is developed, it's usually developed because from tissue that's been removed as they're doing surgery to remove a tumor. And so that's an ethical way to get human cells, if you're just looking at, taking them out of the body, because you don't kill the person and you're removing something that actually needs to be removed because it's tissue that's diseased. So that didn't raise any ethical questions for me at all. So I was just over in my corner doing my research and my hamster and mouse and cancer cell lines. And then we were sitting at a meeting one day of all the laboratory members, and we were running behind on our timeline to apply for the second phase of a grant. Oddly enough, the grant was from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So they feature large in a lot of controversies about vaccines and human health, I think lately. So they were part of my own journey in that way, because we were under the gun for grant funding. And so my boss said, well, everybody that's working on the HIV project needs to do what this one particular lab member is doing. And so I said, well, better figure out if that's ethical or not. So I turned to her and I said, what cell line are you using? And she said HEK 293. And I didn't know at the time that HEK, what HEK stood for. So I asked her, and she said human embryonic kidney. And when she said human embryonic kidney, I knew I had a problem, because those cells were not going to have been obtained ethically. Those cells were going to have been obtained from a baby that basically gave its life for those cells to be harvested. Because if you're taking kidney cells from an embryo, there's kind of only one way to do that. You have to actually extract the embryo from its mother, and then you have to extract the kidney from the embryo. And I didn't know all the things that I know now about the way that that's done, or how that happens, or how just horrible and tragic all of that is. I didn't know the things that I know now about it, just the how many different drugs are made using aborted fetal cell lines, and how many of them actually require new abortions, not just old abortions that happened, 10 or 20 or 40 years ago, that we've made a cell line from, that we can keep growing perpetually in the lab. And I didn't know any of those things, but I knew that I couldn't work with tissue that came from an aborted baby, because if I'm trying to develop vaccines that are an ethical alternative to vaccines that are made using aborted fetal cells, and I'm using aborted fetal cells in the very vaccine I'm producing, I just I couldn't look at myself in the mirror every morning and do that. So that's how I
So,
ended up finding out, and that's why I ended up leaving.
I think that this brings up a few things. Number one is that you were saying that with what happens to, I mean, this is a little earlier in the discussion than I was thinking for us to talk about this, but since you brought
Sure.
it up, why don't we just at least touch upon this? I think that most people, when they think about fetal stem cells being used,
Hmm.
or any parts of babies being used, I think that many people might just think, well, if a baby is going to be aborted, or if a baby was aborted, why don't we just use that body part for something good? And there are some people who actually think it's a good thing to do. There are, Christians who are saying that this makes this tragic event a blessing that comes out of it. And I don't see it this way, but maybe you could explain, what is it that actually happens for these babies' parts to be used for research and the making of medications?
Sure, sure. So there's I mean, even before we get to like the details of that, there's basically two principles that are involved into to why, even if it was a completely like painless medical procedure that was just happening on someone who was aborted anyway, um it would make it not okay to use these cell lines. And the first principle is that evil may not be done, that good may come of it. And the
Right.
second principle is that we are made in the image and likeness of God.
Yes.
So, you know, we understand from scripture, and often from our own experience, that God can bring good from evil. And so people sometimes use that just as justification for like, oh, well, this evil thing happened and therefore I can use it for good. But God and I are two very different people, and God can do things that I cannot do. And so human beings we live in a fallen state. We have original sin that we contracted from our parents, who contracted from their parents, who goes all the way back to the original sin of Adam. This is again another reason why creation is important. If there was no Adam, we don't need our Lord. We don't need Jesus Christ to save us if there was no original sin. So this is a really important fundamental theological point. So we're fallible. We can't know all the things that we would know to be able to really infallibly take something that happened that was evil and make it good. And because we don't know that, God has forbidden us to try. Because guess what? When we try, we actually do really horrible things. There's almost no one, including all the way up to Hitler and Stalin, who thought that they were acting for purely evil purposes. They thought they were doing something good, and we can all agree that they didn't do much good at all, but they thought they were doing something good, and then they justified the evil that they were doing for the good end that they envisioned. We can't do that. We're not allowed to do that. We don't have the knowledge to do that. We don't have the holiness to do that, and we don't have the power to do that. Only God can bring good out of evil. Man is not permitted to try to do that.
And so the first argument is that we have to look at the act of abortion itself and say, is this something that we are going to even participate in? And then once we have participated in, are we going to justify it because we have another end that we think that this can help? And so the ends do not justify the means.
Exactly. The ends don't justify the means. And if you look at, so as Catholics, we have just a lot of things kind of codified in terms of the way that we think about particular moral things. And one of the things that we talk about is there are 4 sins that cry out to heaven for vengeance, and one of them is willful murder. And so these 4 sins that cry out to heaven for vengeance are some of the worst sins that people could commit and do commit. And when you have an abortion, that is willfully killing another human being who is made in the image and likeness of God. That constitutes willful murder. So I can't take this sin that is one of the worst sins that man can commit against another man, and then say, oh, I'm going to use it and do something good with it. So that's the basic first principle. And then it kind of leads us into the second principle, which is we're made in the image and likeness of God. Amen. Right? And since we are made in the image and likeness of God, there's only one thing that is appropriate to do with a human body once the human body has died, and Scripture actually tells us this. It's to bury that body, because we don't burn our bodies, we don't cremate our bodies like the pagans did to show that we're just going into nothing. We bury our bodies just as our Lord was buried, just as there were so many different people that were praised in the Old Testament for burying the dead. I don't know if you have the Book of Tobit in your Bible. I know that Protestants have a little bit different canon than Catholics do, but the Book of Tobit's a really beautiful. It's a beautiful, beautiful story. Where an older gentleman, specifically because he is burying the dead, so the people who've taken the Jews into captivity at that point are slaughtering them and just letting their bodies rot in the street, which is disrespectful both to the person who's killed and to God, because that person is made in God's image and likeness. You can't just leave the body to rot in the street. That's an offense against God as well as an offense against the man. So he would, in secret at night, go and bury the bodies of the people who have been slain, at risk to his own life, because if he had been caught doing it, he would himself have been slain as well. So it's a really beautiful story of how because he has that piety and that faith and that particular act, that God rewards that faithfulness with 10 and 100-fold, as he talks about doing in Scripture. It's really beautiful. So I recommend that you read it. You can find it in any Catholic Bible.
Okay, I didn't know
online
that
as well.
The Catholic Bible had that book and had.
Yes. I think we have 7 books that are missing in the Protestant Bibles. So, and bits of Esther and bits of Daniel. But so just that's the appropriate thing to do with the human body, is to bury the body, to surrender the body back to God in the way that God has set down for us in terms of the customs that you go through. Because when we think about the way that we render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and we render to God what is God's, right? And God has shown us how to render to him what is his, including things like the burial of human bodies being the appropriate kind of thing to do when someone dies.
So, I had a question.
Sure.
You were saying that you were putting different parts onto the virus
Hmm.
in your research. So you had a human cancer cell,
Hmm.
you had a mouse and a hamster. What were the mouse and hamsters being used for?
So we were growing, shoot, I think we were, I don't remember because I only ever got as far as culturing them. And I never actually did any experiments in them because they were so hard. They ended up being so difficult to culture in the laboratory, the ones that I was working with.
So
Um,
I guess the
but the
question is that typical that when you're
mhm.
working with vaccine production or medication production, that you have different parts of different animals and different parts of their
Yeah,
cells
so
going to
when you're
apply.
working with a virus, you have to grow a virus in a cell
Hmm.
because if you don't, viruses are so complicated, we can't make them in a test tube. So, you hear claims sometimes that scientists have created life. I'm sorry I used so many quotes in this conversation, but with that synthetic organism that supposedly they created, it was called it Cynthia. Craig Venter's team did it. But really what they did was they took the genetic information out of an already existing cell and they put synthetic genetic information into that cell and they patterned that synthetic genetic information from another cell. So really they all they did was make some DNA. They didn't actually create quote unquote synthetic life because life is so complicated that we can't reassemble it in a test tube. And even a virus, which is the simplest thing that could possibly be considered living, and many people don't consider viruses to be living, even a virus is so complicated we can't grow it in a test tube. So with the bacteriophage, we actually grew that in E. coli cells, which are a bacterial cell because that's the kind of cell that the virus infects, right? I don't remember what the cancer cell line and the CHO cell line, the Chinese hamster ovary cell line we're going to use for the mouse cell line was actually dendritic cells, I'm pretty sure. And that was the cells I was trying to target. So if I'm putting something on the virus that I want to make sure targets it to a specific kind of cell, then I need to have a cell line of those specific kind of cells in the laboratory. And then, I think your part of your question too is like, well, why hamster? Why mouse? Why do we have all these different organisms that we're working for on this project, right? And one of the reasons that we do that in the laboratory is, I think, goes back again to our belief in evolution. So we believe that we're all sort of connected, and that all animals are just sort of on the same like gradient of things that all go back to a common ancestor. And since people operate under the assumption that that is true, then what they have is all these different model animal systems where you say, well, we can't do an experiment in a human because it wouldn't be ethical to do that, but we'll do it in a mouse, and then we'll take the information that we got from the mouse and we'll extrapolate that to human beings. And that's where you get animal studies for like clinical trials and things like that. And there's a certain extent to which it seems to make sense to do animal studies or to do studies in animal cells because human tissue is more difficult to obtain. Human cell lines are going to be, there's going to be ethical questions surrounding them. And there are a lot of people who object to the HeLa cell line, which is a cancer cell line, but it was removed from a Black woman without her consent. And since it was done without her consent and uh, not retribution, that's not the right word, but no compensation was given to her or to her family for the massive amount of money that was made off this cell line once it was created. That became a big scandal, and there are a lot of people who wouldn't use that cell line. So people kind of get, they get. There's a lot of ethical questions about human cell lines, even aside from the aborted fetal cells. Um, so sometimes people find it easier to try to develop animal cell lines, then we'll do an experiment in the animal cells and then assume it's going to work the same way in human cells. And there's a couple of problems with that. And if you're if you've ever had a dog, you know that dogs shouldn't have grapes or chocolate. Those things are toxic for your dog. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have grapes or chocolate because you can eat grapes and chocolate just fine. And there are a lot of other organisms that can eat grapes and chocolate just fine. And so what we learn in an animal model doesn't always translate into a human model. And it's unfortunately one of the ways that we've hamstrung the pharmaceutical industry, I think, is our heavy reliance on animal models, even animal cell models, because it just doesn't always translate into human. So I went off on a wild tangent there. Sorry.
Well, I know I was just curious because like you were going to attach different parts to this was it a bacteriophage that you were going
Yeah, it
to
was a
attach?
virus, a bacteria virus, basically. So, and
Okay.
it had a capsid, that capsid, you could take two different proteins off that capsid, and then you could attach things to those proteins, and you could stick them back on the capsid. It would self-assemble if you just put it all in a test tube. That part of it would, because because those proteins just kind of locked into place like a magnet would.
Mm-hmm.
And so we would modify those proteins and then lock them back into place like little magnets, and then you'd have this capsid that had, just as an example everybody's familiar with, right? If we were designing a COVID vaccine, it would have had the spike protein all on the outside of it. So then it would look like a COVID virus to your body, but it would actually be a bacterial virus, which means that it couldn't infect you, but it could still cause your body to mount an immune response. So that was kind of the general idea that we were going for there.
Mm. So it's just interesting that you're having like different parts from different animals, including humans and
Hmm.
type of thing. It just it's
Yeah, that
interesting.
raises some ethical questions too, right?
Well, yeah, or just like biblically, is this something that,
Hmm.
as you look back at the way that God healed and at the principles of healing in the Bible, is this something that um, is according to what his plan for us would be? It just
Hmm.
makes you wonder. Um, so
Absolutely.
and these are animals that we typically don't even think of as being clean versus unclean, for people who are
Yeah. Yeah,
interested
that's a
in
good
it, I
point.
think. And
Hmm.
so yeah. Now the other thing that I wanted to ask you about is that when you
Hmm.
when you left vaccines, because you said this involves human fetal cells and I can't be a part of this. Uh,
Hmm.
you left it because of that stance on abortions and the sanctity of life, but you
Hmm.
still believed in evolution at that time.
I did, and I still believed in vaccines as well.
And that was in 2019?
That was in 2000, and joined the lab in 2010, and I left the lab in 2012. And then I taught from 2012 to 2019 until I fell and broke my ankle.
Okay, so
So,
when was it, like, was it a journey along the way from 2012 to, because 2012 you still believed in evolution
yeah.
and vaccines, and then
Uh-huh.
what happened along that journey? How
So
did you?
I met my boss in 2013 or 14.
Mhm.
I had a colleague who was I was working at the school with him, and he attended the traditional Latin mass, and he was a creationist. And I was like, you're crazy for both of those things. And now I do both those things myself. So so he was kind of instrumental in my conversion. His name was Bill, but he told me about a seminar on creation and evolution that he's like, you really need to go to this. And I said, oh, well, that's interesting, because even when I was in graduate school, and I still thought that evolution was the way that everything came to be, because I just kind of assumed that, this whole body of scientific knowledge couldn't just all be wrong. But because I couldn't really fathom how, I wasn't thinking of it, I guess, in the way of, if you start with the wrong premises and you build on the wrong premises, you can have an entire body of knowledge that's totally wrong. So I wasn't thinking about that way at the time. So I just kind of assumed that, well, all this stuff, all this published research, there must be something to it. So, but somehow God also created the world, and I didn't really think about it too hard, but I did
Oh, so you
understand.
did believe that there was a creator God.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So I guess you could say I believed something that we would call theistic evolution. So I believed that evolution happened, but I didn't believe in atheistic evolution, because I knew, and I was accumulating data like all throughout undergrad and graduate school. So from 2000 on to 2012 or 13, that there's no way that this stuff could happen by itself. Like there's just absolutely no way it could happen by itself. And if anybody's really interested in looking like doing a deep dive on that on a scientific level, there's two books that I would recommend. The first one is called The Stairway to Life. It's by Rod Statler and Change Laura Tan. And it talks about, and this is for people who are really willing to nerd out for a little bit about biochemistry, because it really talks about how impossible it is to go from inorganic chemistry to organic chemistry, so from non-living molecules and elements to an actual living cell. And that part is a lot harder for people to talk about because so many people feel like they just don't understand anything about cells or about DNA or about proteins. But that part is even more impossible than going from one cell to a human being. And so that's a really, really good book for anybody wanting to do a deep dive. Another book, and again, this is very science heavy, is called Evolution's Achilles Heels. And it doesn't have one author. It has 9 PhD scientists as authors. I believe you can get it through creation.com, through their ministry, Creation Ministries International. And these are both written by Protestant scholars. I don't know exactly which denomination they are, but especially the one that's written by 9. I can't keep track of all of them, but they're very, very, very good books if you want to actually look into the science behind, or the lack of science behind, evolution or molecules to man. So I knew, even in graduate school, even when I was an evolutionist, that evolution couldn't have happened by itself. But I think it's actually even worse to think that God created through evolution than it is to think that evolution happened by itself. Because when you talk about the way that God creates, it says something about his character. And if you think about evolution is the building up of nothing into man, which is the crown of God's creation. If we understand scripture at all, we understand that, we're the only thing that's made in the image and likeness of God. We're the only thing that's body, soul, unity. We're the only thing that our Lord came and actually became, became a man. So that's really important. And to think that God went from a cell to man through millions of years of mutation and defect and struggle for survival and death, millions and millions of years of death before sin ever entered the world, that does say something about the character of God. And I didn't understand what I was believing about the character of God until Mr. Owen pointed it out. And so it was that seminar in 2013 or 2014, so about 10 years ago now, that I actually went to just to listen to the biologist who was presenting with him at the time, who's Dr. Joseph Strata, who's since retired. He doesn't travel with us anymore because he's at the ripe old age where travel is just not so much fun anymore. But he talked about all these reasons why the evolutionary narrative didn't hold up with science, and he approached it from chemistry and biology and geology and a little bit from physics as well. And so he was saying things I'd never heard before, but also things that I had suspected were true, but didn't really have the data to back that up at the time. So I was like, wow, yeah, that's right. Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely, evolution couldn't happen by itself. But I didn't go all the way to say, well, but evolution didn't happen at all, until I heard my boss speak. And he put up a slide where he said, basically, here's what you can believe about the character of God if you believe that he created the way he said he did. And here's what you have to believe about the character of God if you believe he created through evolution. And I looked at that slide and I said, I believe in that God, not that God. I have to be a creationist. Oh no. So I was flabbergasted. I walked out of that event just flabbergasted. And I happen to know a guy who also taught at my school who knew Mr. Owen personally. And I said, I can't believe this stuff about the character of God, but I can't believe that evolution didn't happen, because I believe evolution happened for all of these like scientific reasons. And he's like, well, why don't we go to lunch with Mr. Owen and you can ask him all your questions? So I was that guy, who was just I'm gonna throw all the impertinent questions I can throw at you. And I asked him all kinds of questions at that lunch, and he didn't give me answers that I found satisfactory.
Mm.
because he wasn't a biologist. And so I didn't feel like he was taking the science seriously enough. But he gave me the title of a book, and that book was called Genetic Entropy. It's by Dr. John Sanford. That's another great one if you want to do a really deep dive on how mutations can't possibly be the mechanism of building up of new kinds of life forms. He does a really, really, really great job. And if you try to read that, I'm a biologist and I've been a biologist like for my whole adult life. I got stuck on his chapter about noise because I had a hard time like thinking through the statistics. That doesn't mean that you have to give up on the book at that point. The rest of the book is quite readable, but the chapter on noise is in the middle. So if you get there and you're like, I don't understand this, just skip it and go to the next one. Um, and don't feel bad because I have a master's in this and I didn't understand it either. So, um, but the rest of the book makes a very, very good case for why you can't build up something new and functional through repeated mistakes, mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake. I mean, and if we think about it philosophically for just a few minutes, we understand that makes sense, right? That fits with the first principles, things that we have to understand to be true. Like something can't give what it doesn't have, and I can't both be and not be at the same time. I mean, these are things that are self-evident. You don't have to prove them to people. At least you shouldn't. Like back when we were thought a little bit more reasonably, you didn't have to prove them to people. But um so yeah, so that conversation kind of sparked me forward. And then Mr. Owen asked me to attend their annual leadership conference. And I didn't know that I was going to get all of my questions and more answered in a week, but we do, the Colby Center does, we call it a leadership conference. Really, you don't have to be wanting to be a leader in the Colby Center to go. You can just be curious about creation and evolution, and how that relates to the Catholic faith, but also how it relates to biology and physics and chemistry, and how it relates to philosophy, and how it relates to everyday life, because it does affect how we live. And so we do a week-long conference in August every year, and I've presented at it. So I went in like 2015, 2016. It was a couple years after I met Mr. Owen, and then I've been presenting at it every year since. So I went still somewhat skeptical, still had a lot of questions, still wasn't really quite sure. And by halfway through that week, I was like, nope, nope, this is rock solid. This is how it is. Evolution really doesn't have a leg to stand on. And I've been doing research, like you said, I get paid to read books. As you're talking about a little bit ago. It's one of the large parts of what I do now for the Colby Center is research, is read. That's why I have all of these crazy titles behind me. This whole shelf is for work from the
Mhm.
floor to the ceiling, and most of that one too. So I read a lot. I've learned a lot, and I still haven't found. In fact, I've found even less than I thought 10 years ago, or 8 years ago would really support or could potentially support evolution theory. And I remember at first I used to be scared to read something new that came out in science in a scientific journal that supposedly provided evidence for evolution. I'm like, oh no, they're gonna actually figure it out. There's gonna be some sort of scientific evidence that I can't square with the faith. And every time I read it, it's like, nope, 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 that doesn't
Yeah.
actually prove
Yeah.
anything that they're saying it proves. So the more that I
I
read, the more convinced I am there's just no evidence for it.
I think that it just goes to show that, truth has to be consistent across all different walks of life. Because I feel like this is what the devil does to really confuse people. He tries to cause us to compartmentalize things and say, okay, that's your belief, that's your spirituality. Real life
Hmm.
is this. And then what he gets us to do is that we put science on a pedestal, we put intellectualism on a pedestal, and then we allow him to define, this is what science is, and
Hmm.
this is what it means to be an intellect. According to the Bible, it was the followers of Satan who became the great men of the world. And
Hmm.
so God's people have to understand, though, that true science, if God truly exists, and if he is truth, and if he's the one that created everything, according to certain laws, science will be able to observe those laws and to account for that. You're going to be able to see that in data if we would
Mhm.
allow those things to be published. And so my question is, now we've established that, you first walked away from vaccine science because of an ideology, a religious belief, a
Mhm.
spiritual belief. And then you found out that you believed also in a biblical account of how the world came to be, which is creation. And that
Mhm.
was a huge, huge revelation for you. Now, how were you able to put together your belief about science, um, and your ideology about the sanctity of life and vaccines?
Mhm.
So the question is, if you believe in vaccines, can you believe in creation?
Sure. Um, and so I'm gonna turn it around a little bit and answer the question like, where did the belief in vaccines come from? And that'll
Okay,
shed light on the
great,
question that you just
great.
asked. Right. So vaccines, that there's I think unfortunately the talk has been pulled from YouTube, where I gave an interview with my pastor and he talked very clearly and very well about the Enlightenment. So we don't think about the Enlightenment too much nowadays. It doesn't register as quite the earth-shattering event that it was, or some people have a very positive opinion of it because all they ever heard about in school was, we went through the dark Middle Ages and then we had the dawn of reason and now everything is better. Which is a very oversimplified and incorrect version of the Enlightenment. And we were talking a little bit before we came on about just that there's been a current of people who are willing to compromise on the literal understanding of the scriptures, who are willing to compromise on the truth of the scriptures, that dates back not just to in the Catholic Church we had sort of a liturgical upheaval in the 1960s, and a lot of people want to say, well, all the problems date back to the 1960s that we're dealing with today, but it actually dates back many centuries earlier to when people started denying scriptural truths and saying that the human mind, human reason could think these things through, really well. And that kind of enlightenment thought then leads us to where, Richard Dawkins is saying, Darwinism allowed you to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, so that you could be an atheist and you could have some sort of conception of where we came from and where we're going. you know so so it started, and my colleague John Wynn, who's with Restoring the Truth Ministries out in Kansas, he does a really good job in two books. One is called Catholic Assessment of Evolution Theory, but the other one is called Darwin's Last Icon. In Darwin's Last Icon especially, he talks about how all of this goes back to Descartes and his idea that, I think, therefore I am. And so the only thing that I can know that's real is my own reasoning about things. And then that actually led to the intellectual milieu in which Charles Darwin could argue that everything came from one common ancestor, and because we see similarities in these things that exist, therefore we can trace those similarities all the way back. And so I can reason my way through that and sort of think about how that could have happened, and therefore that is the truth that he's going to then is the truth in little t, that he thinks he's going to write about in On the Origin of Species, right? So Descartes led to Darwin. So this idea, this divorce between an external reality that I have to conform my intellect to, and instead making it, the internal reality, what I can think and what I can reason, that's what I can really know. And then you have Lyell too, who is the geologist walking around the countryside thinking that, well, we see sediments depositing very slowly over time. And so if I dig down a certain number of feet, I'm going to go back this many years because I'm assuming that the sediments depositing the same rate over all of
Mhm.
time, and that's how you get the millions of years, and then that gives Darwin time for his evolution. And so Lyell and Darwin weren't really doing experiments the way that we think of scientific experiments now. In fact, Lyell didn't do anything at all. He just wandered around the countryside and thought about stuff. So you have these two men who have their thoughts that are so disconnected from reality, that and again, we're building on a foundation that's wrong, but then everything built on that foundation is somewhat interiorly consistent. It's not perfectly interiorly consistent because you can't be consistent if you're built on a falsehood, but it's interiorly consistent enough that then people were able to buy it, right? So this is the environment that then Edward Jenner comes along into, and everybody knows Edward Jenner as the founder of the process of vaccination, even though the thing that he did was actually done by another guy named Benjamin Jesty about 20 years prior. He took cowpox and inoculated his wife and children against smallpox using cowpox, and he's not as well known, and his case isn't as well documented. So why would somebody think that taking disease material and putting it into a perfectly healthy individual would be helpful to them? Right. Well, I think, and I talk about this in one of the chapters of the book that I wrote, The Vaccination: A Catholic Perspective, that because we have this enlightenment thinking, which leads to this evolutionary thinking, which leads us to think that our bodies are cosmic accidents, that really nothing is directing our formation, nothing is directing the development of our bodies or the systems within our bodies. And so then you have this is where you get inconsistent, right? Because then you think that this brain that has supposedly evolved from nothing through lots of mistakes, this brain can fix all the problems in this body. And that's the enlightenment, ultimately the enlightenment error as kind of encapsulated through evolution that then bled into medicine. Right. So the enlightenment error is that my reason is above everything. The evolutionary error is that my body is a giant mistake. And you put those two together, and then you think, I can figure out how to keep my body healthy better than working with the systems that God actually designed. And so you get a couple of different problems there. One is you're treating your body like it's a mistake. And so like you have to intervene in order to intervene in some drastic way that wouldn't normally occur.
When you say mistake, you mean like an accident, like a spontaneous thing that
Yeah, so like
happened.
I'm more thinking of mutation. So my background is primarily in genetics, and mutation is a mistake in your DNA,
Mhm.
right? And so if you make a mistake in your DNA and then another mistake in your DNA and another mistake in your DNA, and you do this millions of times over billions of years, and that's how everything came here, then everything is just basically one long, series of chromosomes of mistakes, and of copying mistakes. And so that's more specifically what I'm thinking of. But it's also the idea of being a cosmic accident, that like we didn't have to be here, we didn't, just it was some random chemistry in a warm little pond somewhere, so you can think of it either way.
Okay.
But in particular, it's helpful to think of it in terms of like if mutations are driving evolutionary progress, right? If mistakes in the code are driving evolutionary progress, that means that anything in my body that's good is bound to be flawed. Um, and that is actually technically true. That's kind of what we see, that our bodies don't work perfectly and they aren't perfectly good. But there's two ways to understand that, right? One is to understand that we were a mistake from the beginning and we're a product of billions of years of mistakes. And the other is to understand that we were made perfect in the beginning and all the mistakes now are a product of the fall. So we're
Mhm.
getting worse, not better, or we're getting better, but we're still worse. That's the two ways that you can think about it. um, so I prefer that we were created perfect in the beginning, because again, that says something about God's character, right? He made man perfect. He made the world perfect. He didn't make it this horrible, nasty struggle for survival. He made it perfect and we screwed it up. And that says something about him and it says something about us. And quite frankly, what it says about us isn't very flattering. And that's probably one of the other justifications for believing in evolution, right? It's a little bit more positive picture of us. We're the best thing that came out of evolution since sliced bread, instead of being like, you were the reason that all of this is pretty messed up, so um so so if you're coming, so when I explain this to nurses, they really get it, because it's funny, because when I explain it to doctors, they're still way up here in their head about like dealing with health and dealing with human bodies. But nurses, when you have to change bedpans and you have to get in there and get like really nitty gritty with someone else's body when they're in pain, and they're suffering, like you understand a whole lot more about how the body works, and you understand a whole lot more intuitively that even though it's flawed, even though it's fallen, the body is an integrated whole. And I
Mhm.
can't change something in one part of the body and expect it not to exchange something in other parts of the body. And this is another problem that you get with evolution that's really important, because you're not just a series of mistakes, but you're also a series of modular mistakes. So I can make a mistake in one part of your body and it doesn't really affect the rest of your body. I can change
Mm.
one thing at a time, if you will, and that's how Darwinian evolution is supposed to work. You gradually develop, it's not like you pop into existence with your eyes and your ears and your brain and your sense of smell all fully
Mm.
integrated in your head, and that's just working. You're changing one of those systems at a time as you're evolving. And so that
Mhm.
means that now, if I'm dealing with health, I can change one of your systems at a time. I can do something that affects your circulatory system, and it's fine. It won't affect your lymphatic system, and it won't affect your brain,
Right.
and it won't affect
Yeah.
your muscular system. And we just know from experience, anybody who's ever been chronically ill or ever been in
Right.
medicine knows that's not true. I actually had in this whole rigmarole with my ankle, I actually had a doctor tell me, I'm going to give you a steroid shot. And I was like, I don't want steroids. I have really bad reactions to steroids. And he just looks at me. He's like, well, it'll stay in your foot. And I'm like, are you serious? Are you serious? I mean, I'm a cellular biologist and a geneticist. I tell people sometimes if it's bigger than a cell, I can't really help you. But I know that I have a lymphatic system, and I know that whatever like fluid is in my tissues is going to go right back into my circulatory system. This thing's going to go straight to my heart and also to my head. So
I,
let's
I feel
not
like that's what
pretend.
they said about this COVID vaccine, that it would
Yeah.
stay here. And
Yeah. Yeah, it'll stay in your arm. No, no, it won't stay in your arm. You have fluid that's constantly washing over all the cells in your body that goes right back into your circulatory system, and in a matter of seconds or minutes, depending on the area of your body and depending on how fast the fluid is moving through, because it doesn't have perfect 100% turnover every second. Um,
well,
so
this
yeah.
thinking, I mean, I think it's helpful for us to understand like how people think and how people,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
medicine and science might think. That's an interesting thing. So,
Right.
but keep on going. So you're saying,
Sure. Right.
so we're talking specifically about um, if you believe in vaccines, how does it
Mm-hmm.
relate to creation and evolution?
Right, because we haven't quite got to vaccines yet. So,
Yeah.
so basically, what a vaccine if you were to look at it philosophically, it's a product of the Enlightenment thinking that we can overthink or outthink all those mistakes in our body, and the thing that I've thought about and observed in nature, I can then manipulate in the laboratory, and I can do a better job at doing the body's job than the body can, through my thought process. So then, so that's specifically applied in a vaccine in terms of instead of working with the immune system and the way that it actually works in the body. And now Jenner wasn't as guilty of this as people are now, because we understand so much more about the immune system now than he did then. I mean,
Mm.
immunology wasn't a science when Jenner got started. And so it's really a shame that we use 150-year-old technology that was founded without any actual basic research as our basic, safety mechanism for pediatrics. It's just really that wouldn't be tolerated, I think, in any other area of technology. Um, so you have this idea that you can take something that you've isolated, like a piece, that you've isolated out of the body or out of a bacteria, you can inject that in the body and you can have an immune response. So the development of vaccines kind of coincided with the discovery of antibodies, and that's why the two have always been so coherently linked, right? And one of the reasons that antibodies became such a big thing with vaccination is because when you vaccinate with certain things like diphtheria toxin and tetanus toxin, the antibodies will bind the toxin, and that actually kind of like it sops up the toxin, sort of like you can think of like a paper towel. Like if you had a bunch of tiny little paper towels that were really specific for those toxins floating around in your body, they would soak them up instead of those toxins harming you. And so we noticed that if you took antibodies from a horse that was injected with tetanus and put it in a human being, so again, you get the like cross species weirdness that we were talking about earlier going on. That those antibodies would protect that human being. So then we decided that antibodies were the part of the immune system that was important. And then we started to gear vaccines to produce antibodies because we could measure for antibodies before we could measure for a lot of other things in the immune system. So there's two things that are going on there, right? We're taking the vaccine and we're injecting it in the body in a non-natural way because we've outsmarted our immune systems, or so we think. And the other thing is that we're assuming that those antibodies can be tinkered with in a way that doesn't affect the rest of the body. and that those antibodies by themselves are responsible for our immune system. Now, both of those I would say are very like Enlightenment evolutionary errors. But the second one about the antibodies being you can mess with them without messing with the rest of your body, or even that they're as important as they are, like you have this one thing that's going to make you immune. Those are evolutionary errors, because when you start talking about the body being a collection of mistakes, when you see something you don't understand in the body, it's very easy for an evolutionist to just be like, oh, that's a mistake, that's an evolutionary holdover, that doesn't really matter, I don't really need to understand why that's working the way that it's working. Because it's just evolved from the monkeys and it's continuing to evolve over time. And if I don't see a clear purpose for it, then it's just a useless leftover. And we see this in a concrete way with like tonsils and the appendix. Everybody, even my age growing up, was probably taught that your tonsils and your appendix are useless organs that are just kind of evolutionary leftovers. Turns out they're a really important part of your immune system. If you think tonsils in particular, they sit like right here, at the entry point for almost everything that could make you sick. Your tonsils are right there, guarding that entry point. And so there's a lot of immune activity there, but we weren't able to see that a long time ago. So people would get their tonsils removed because these were supposedly evolutionary leftovers. So we're taking this idea that we can vaccinate somebody and protect them from disease. We can take out their God-given disease protection and they'll be fine. And we're putting all of that together and slowly and gradually leading into modern medicine, which is, what we have now, where like you have a couple of, well, you just have so many things going wrong, but one of the things going wrong is like, one disease, one drug kind of thing. Like there's a drug for everything. We'll just give you this drug. It'll have some side effects. So we are sort of tacitly acknowledging that it does affect other parts of your body, but we're still treating your body like it's modular. Like we can affect one part and not affect the other parts. And so I think with vaccines, there's a lot of, I've really just kind of touched on philosophically and not so much
Just
scientifically.
philosophically.
Yeah,
So that's a philosophical aspect of it. It's
right.
the history of evolution, maybe the mindset behind evolution, and 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 now that you've gotten into more of researching creation and science
Hmm.
and that type of thing. Um, you know, I think we all know that when it comes to any kind of health topic,
Hmm.
that you can find literature that is going to be both supportive of one body of belief, and then you're going to find literature that's going to be against it, right?
Hmm.
Um, so I would imagine the same thing is true for vaccines, because there are a number of people who say that, even before vaccines came on the scene, that a lot of these diseases were on their way out already.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then there are other people, I think the majority of people, who believe that it was only because of vaccines
Hmm.
that we don't have smallpox, and we
Sure.
don't have measles and mumps and rubella and these types of things. Although some of them I don't know. Some of them aren't even just that terrible of diseases. It seems like we just
Right.
have a vaccine for some of these things. And so
Sure.
I'm thinking, like, what kind of research is it that people are looking at when they say, okay, vaccines came and basically saved the world?
Hmm.
And, is there strength to that? Or, what is the evidence saying for both sides?
Sure. So, when you start going into the biological and the safety and the in terms of like, what do I do with my children or what do I do with myself? Then you hit people in a lot more emotional place than when you're just talking about the philosophy.
Mm.
And you're also dealing with a lot, just like I dealt in my conversion to being believing in creation. I had to deal with a lot of my own emotional, feedback on that in terms of like, well, I don't want everybody to think I'm stupid going out here and talking about God making the world in 6 days. Like nobody believes that, and so you have this sense that like nobody believes that, but like the more that I go around the world and talk to people, the more I'm so, oh, that people do believe, oh, these people believe that. Oh, these people always believed that. Like I didn't have to convince these people at all. And it's funny how you get this like sort of mainstream like wall of news, and it says, well, everybody knows that vaccines are safe and effective, you know, and that's actually not the case. I've met so many people all over the country who have said, you know, my child was perfectly fine until this vaccine, you know, or that vaccine, or, you know, I was perfectly fine myself until I've met adults who were vaccine injured, and not just from the COVID vaccine, you know, so um you know, so I think one of the things that like we really have to overcome if we're talking about vaccines in general is just it's sort of a two-pronged emotional response. And one is the whole, but everybody says they're safe and effective, you know, and that this idea that there's this much larger mainstream consensus than there actually is.
Mm,
Just like, you know, you could argue that with creation and evolution. Well, everybody believes in evolution. Well, no, everybody doesn't. And when you look at the science, there's actually not that much evidence, right?
right.
Um, you know, and but then you also have to overcome the but I need my kids to be safe, you
Mm,
know, and I'm worried about all these things that are very, very dangerous. And so you kind of have to address both of those issues. And that covers a lot of ground. It probably covers a lot more ground than we can cover in this podcast.
mhm,
So definitely, I'm going to refer people to two books that I think are just absolutely phenomenal. They're groundbreaking and they're easy to read, even, you know, for a non-biologist, I would say. So the first one is Dissolving Illusions, by Dr. Suzanne Humphreys. And so Dissolving Illusions deals with the history of vaccination, and particularly it deals with smallpox. Like I think half of the book, and the book is pretty extensive, is about smallpox. Because, you know, smallpox and polio are usually the things that are touted as like, but vaccines saved us from these horrible diseases, you know, that were just absolutely terrible. And so, you know, some of the things that you'll learn in Dissolving Illusions are that the two boys that Edward Jenner vaccinated,
mhm,
his own son and the neighbor boy, they did not go on to develop smallpox after vaccination, but they both went on to die of tuberculosis in their early 20s. And that's a really curious thing because tuberculosis has a very long incubation period, and it's very likely that they were actually exposed to this bloodborne disease through Jenner's multiple vaccinations when they were 8 or 9. And then they eventually died from the disease over a decade later. So that is a very curious dark side of vaccine history that we don't hear about a lot.
Do
One of the
you,
other
do
things
you
you'll learn.
think do you think that that is something that people would say, oh, is that is that really good evidence, or is that more
Mhm.
circumstantial? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
sure.
were there a
So
lot of people dying of TB at that time, or
um when you're looking at evidence, you know, you have to understand there are two kinds of ways to build evidence, right? One is a sort of a like this point, this point, this point, this point, this point, this point, all these points support my argument. And the other is I make this point, which makes me make this point, which makes me make this point, which makes me make this point, which gives me my argument. Now, if I've got this, if any one of those is weak, it doesn't matter because we're looking at the sum total. If I've got this, it really matters if one of them is weak, right? So when we're looking at this case against vaccines, we're actually looking at this, not this.
Mhm.
So it's that multiple points. So one of the other points that goes along with this is that the incidence of syphilis in infants skyrocketed when vaccine campaigns were increased or introduced in England against smallpox. Now, most people don't realize the original smallpox vaccine wasn't the kind of vaccine that's sort of sterile, like lab generated thing that we think about now. It was you scratched some smallpox pustules into somebody's arm from somebody
Mhm.
who was sick with smallpox, well, cowpox, you know, initially. But then, so then that person had a reaction, and then you scratch that person's wound open and you put that in somebody else's arm. So you're transmitting all kinds of bloodborne diseases with the original method of vaccination. And you know, and again, if you're going to present the history of vaccination, you need to present this information as well as the information that, you know, some of the individuals were protected from smallpox. Now, other times you saw outbreaks of smallpox after vaccination. In fact, the outbreaks were more common than the individual protection. Vaccine injury was a thing starting with smallpox vaccines. And there were fines leveled against people who in England who refused to get vaccinated again because, you know, smallpox vaccines weren't good for life. They were more like flu vaccines or COVID vaccines, where people were recommending you get them every 6 months to a year, not understanding anything about immune exhaustion. You know, and there's a well documented case in Dissolving Illusions of a gentleman whose 3 children were vaccine injured, and he refused to vaccinate his fourth. And I think there may have been a death involved with one of the children. I don't really remember, but the three of them got very, very, very sick. And then the city he was living in England fined him for not getting the fourth one vaccinated because even at the beginning, there was so much faith in this process, probably because there was so much fear of smallpox that we just, it ran with it, and when you're dealing with, you're dealing with people who don't necessarily have a very strong faith in the face of a disease that they find very frightening or terrifying. And in smallpox in particular, if you think about, the death rate was fairly high for diseases that we encounter in the modern age, is probably on par with something like yellow fever, maybe a little bit less. Um, but it just actually probably actually a lot less than yellow fever, but your chances of getting yellow fever are lower than getting smallpox. Smallpox is more contagious, but um so you're dealing with something that is highly transmissible. It can lead to death, and when it doesn't lead to death, it leads to disfigurement. And there weren't a lot of, in certain parts of the world, there wasn't a lot of acceptance at the time of somebody who looked different. This is actually the problem that people with leprosy encountered the most. You could recover from leprosy and not continue progressing in leprosy, because it is actually a bacterial disease and your body can clear it. But the disfigurement that happened to your face would show everybody for the rest of your life that you were a leper, and you would never be able to re-enter society. The smallpox is similar, that it would leave your face like pockmarked. So if you were a woman, especially, like, getting smallpox as a young woman could be the sentence to be an old maid for the rest of your life, because no one's going to marry you if you look really disfigured and scarred. So there's a lot of emotionality going on there that we don't think about or don't talk about. And then there's also a lot of superstition, a lot of lack of understanding of how diseases were spread, because they didn't really understand sanitation back then, in the way that we understand it now.
Mhm.
um in the way that we understand the passage of germs now. They probably understood that you shouldn't be living in your own filth. But in the industrial age, the people began living in their own filth because we crowded them into little tiny tenement houses where they can't get rid of it. And so really it's funny that with the rise of industrialization, we see the rise of some of these diseases because we're putting people in far too close proximity without proper sanitation measures.
Mhm.
Because they actually lived a lot cleaner back in the quote unquote dark ages when they lived on farms and lived in a more ordered lifestyle.
Mhm.
Um, so they didn't understand the necessary of sanitation on a large scale, on a large city scale, and the way that we understand it now. They did understand, like, basic personal hygiene. Um, and so so that all of that factors in terms of, like, what we should think about smallpox, right? And then in terms of what we should think about polio, polio is really, our study of polio was really hampered by this one disease, one germ hypothesis, that it kind of grew out of Koch's postulates, which is the idea that you can take a disease out of an organism, you can culture it in the laboratory. If you inject it back into another organism, that organism should develop the same disease and die, and then you've found the cause of that disease. That's how they found the bacteria that causes tuberculosis, right? Well, tuberculosis is a very straightforward issue. It's sort of like the diphtheria and tetanus toxin. Those will totally get cleared up by antibodies, but some other viruses won't. So when we looked at them and then we kind of locked vaccines into, we're looking at antibodies because we happened to start with diphtheria and tetanus, it causes a problem for the field. You get this sort of the same thing, here. And it just, you've got this sort of very early nascent technology, and you kind of lock it into one way of thinking because you happen upon a disease that happens to work that way. So tuberculosis happens to be just caused by one thing, and then therefore we assume that all diseases are caused by one thing. Well, they're not. If you think about, if you list the symptoms: fever, headache, runny nose, and sore throat, well, what disease is causing that? Well, that could be a rhinovirus, that could be a coronavirus, that could be a flu virus, that could be seasonal allergies, that could be, being dehydrated and talking too much. um,
Mhm.
so there's a whole bunch of different, because my throat hurts right now, and I'm probably gonna have a headache from looking at the window and in front of the computer screen, but it's okay. And it's just because I've given too many interviews this week, apparently, because this is my second or third. But um, so there's a lot of different things that can cause that same constellation of symptoms, right? Well, it turns out there's a lot of different things that can cause poliomyelitis, which is the disease that would then become paralytic. And it also turns out that, not very many people who developed poliovirus developed paralytic polio. most of the people who developed paralytic polio recovered from the paralytic polio. The iron lung situation was very uncommon, but that's the images that we see now. That's the revisionist history. There's going to be, I'm sure, revisionist history in our lifetimes of COVID. It's already kind of happening. So we're not unfamiliar with this process. But poliomyelitis can be caused by a dozen different things, only one of which is the polio virus. So coming up with a vaccine for polio didn't really actually do that much to eradicate the cases of paralysis. And it's interesting because some of the other things that cause that paralytic those paralytic symptoms include heavy metal poisoning and DDT. So it's been the observance of some of my friends who live out west. One guy that I know, he was either in the last class that had kids that had polio or the first class that didn't have kids that had polio. So he was right on that edge of like polio, no polio, and in a farming family out in Montana. And their community experience was that when DDT was banned and DDT went away, polio went away. Like that was just what happened in their community. And now that's not a research study, that's anecdotal, but we have to understand that like the evidence in front of us matters actually more than the evidence that's being published in research journals, because I'm not editing that evidence that's actually happening in front of my eyes. If you're living right now and your experience is that I know 50 people who had COVID and 50 people who had the COVID vaccine, and I know way more people who are sick in the vaccinated group, it doesn't matter how many studies get published. Like what's right in front of you is actually what you should be basing your decision on. And that's one of the things that you were sort of touching on earlier in terms of scientific research not always being perfectly in line with reality. So, and then the last thing about polio is if you look on a graph, you will see a line that goes down a little bit, before the polio vaccine, but then you see the polio vaccine and then boom, the line drops, right? So they look on the graph, it looks like the polio vaccine got rid of polio. What the graph doesn't tell you is that they redefined polio diagnosis the year that they introduced the vaccine. So prior to the introduction of the vaccine, if you were paralyzed at all, you were diagnosed with polio. After the introduction of the vaccine, you had to stay paralyzed for 60 days in order to be a true polio case. Now, think about that. Like if most of the cases resolve before 60 days, and I've just changed the definition, so I can't actually write it down in their case history as polio for the CDC statistics unless they stay paralyzed for at least 60 days, I'm going to see a drop on a graph regardless of whether there's a vaccine or not. So sometimes the data gets manipulated that way.
Prior to the vaccine, what was polio defined as?
So polio was defined as any paralysis, especially affecting the lower limbs, but often all the way up. So
and afterwards, it was you had to have it for greater
for
than
60 days.
Okay. I mean, we had a redefinition of COVID that
we did. Oddly enough, when the vaccine came out, they coincided. So the vaccine came out in December, and the redefinition happened in January.
I was looking at measles too. What happened with measles? There were so many similarities with what happened with the measles vaccine and with COVID. It's kind of like people have been studying history.
Yeah. Not the right people, unfortunately. So yeah, Dissolving Illusions talks a lot about measles too, and I don't want to just go on and on and on, but there's one more book I recommend. I actually have it here in my precarious stack. Try not to send my plant flying. This book called Turtles All the Way Down, which was pretty recently published. If you want to understand what we're talking about in terms of scientific research that gets published not always being accurate or not always being very well done, this is the book to read. And if you want another book, there's a book called Bad Pharma by Dr. Ben Goldacre. But they both go into detail about ways that you can sort of massage the outcome of a study before you even get started. And that comes down to like, what placebo are you using? What endpoints are you looking for to determine your efficacy? How are you recording adverse events? Was the study double blind or was it not double blind? There's just a whole list of things you have to look at. And unfortunately, research that gets published tends to be the research that fits with the mainstream opinion rather than the research that's actually the most honestly crafted.
I
So and that goes not just for vaccines, but for evolution as well. Basically any other thing I've looked into. So, but especially vaccines and evolution, and global warming is another one where you have this really
yeah.
strong, like, there's a really strong political one
Mhm.
way or the other, like this is acceptable, that's not acceptable. Well, the studies that would show that vaccines aren't safe don't get funded.
Yes.
The studies that would show that evolution's not happening don't get funded, and people hear that kind of sitting back on the other side of the computer screen, and they're like, oh, well, that's, I mean, what's the big deal? Well, it takes hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to run some of these studies correctly, and in some cases it takes millions and millions of dollars to run like clinical trials correctly. So nobody's going to personally invest hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars into research. They need grant funding. And if they can't get grant funding because their opinion is politically incorrect, they have to be basically Elon Musk levels of independently wealthy to do what they want to do.
Yeah.
And, as we were talking about earlier, the wealthy and powerful of this world don't tend to be the people who are the most interested in seeking the truth, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So it just doesn't, the funding does matter and the politics do matter. And it's really sad because we think of science as this like super objective thing, but it's actually not.
Yes, I know. I know. Um, so I had a question, and this is something that I have had to struggle with because prior to COVID, the reason that, started this podcast was because when COVID happened, we realized that there were a lot of people in the church, my church,
Hmm.
and churches all over who didn't feel comfortable talking about the subject because
Hmm.
they felt like we would be, considered to be troublemakers and, um, just critical people,
Right.
critical.
Or like it's somehow not charitable to your neighbor if you don't wear the mask or you don't get vaccinated. Because that was
Right,
being pushed a lot.
right. And also because you know, I guess people in church leadership were kind of going along with whatever the government was saying, it seemed, and
Hmm. Hmm.
we didn't agree with it necessarily. So my question for you as a very faithful Catholic woman, um,
I try to be.
well, so the question is, why is it, do you think, that your church leadership is is for, say, vaccines in general?
Hmm.
And and that's something that I just learned about as I was going through this whole COVID issue, but it's something that
Hmm.
even back 200 years ago with the smallpox vaccine, um, the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church has a long history, the Catholic Church was in favor of and this kind of thing. And so, we had talked about what causes the Catholic Church to be susceptible to some of these things. And one of them was the intellectualism and that kind of thing. Do you think that's something that played a role even back then, or what do you think it is? And how are you going about it as far as like how, or, you and other Catholics who believe this way about fetal cells and this kind of thing,
Hmm.
or just the science behind vaccinations and that type of thing. How do you reconcile this with what maybe your church leadership is doing?
Sure. So I can't really speak to the smallpox. I'm not aware of any evidence that the Catholic Church supported the smallpox vaccine. That doesn't mean it's out there, it just means I haven't come across it. So if you can forward that to me, I'd be grateful because I'd like
Okay,
to
yeah,
take a look at it.
I will.
But so I don't know of any actual authoritative position on vaccines by the Catholic Church until 1995. And that wasn't even like super authoritative because it was published by the Pontifical Academy of Life. And that's, if you, the hierarchy of the church is like, it's multi-leveled and multi-layered, so it can get a little confusing to somebody who's not involved, but the Pontifical Academy for Life they can issue statements that are theological opinions is probably not kind of the right word, and it doesn't convey quite the sense, but this is something that some bishops and some priests have thought out and they're presenting, but it's not necessarily a binding teaching. Like So we make a distinction between binding and non-binding teachings, so the church has never authoritatively taught in favor of evolution, even though a lot of individuals, including Pope St. John Paul II, have said things that were favorable about evolution. In fact, the churches, if you look at the church's binding teachings, they bind you to things like, believing in the inerrancy of scripture, and that Adam was actually created from the dust of the ground and Eve was actually created from his side, and things like that. So you get a lot of confusion in the last couple of hundred years with, people who, like we were saying earlier, don't want to necessarily follow all the moral codes. So they start inventing reasons to not believe this part of the faith or that part of the faith, or because if I can chink a hole in the armor somewhere, then I can let all kinds of stuff in. So why the position the Catholic Church is taking, in the last 20 years on vaccines, and I can comment on that a little bit, or at least the prelates of the church, right? So one of the things that I noticed in the Pontifical Academy for Life document was and I may have misspoken. I think it was 2005, not 95. But anyway, the 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 document was issued in response to a request from a laywoman called Debbie Vintage. She actually created this website, Children of God for Life. And she said, this is happening. We know now it's happening. Like, give us some guidance on this, and basically what the church, the document says is that, it's not acceptable that we use aborted fetal cells in vaccines. That is not in keeping with church teaching at all. It's actually not a problem if, as a parent, you want to conscientiously object and not receive that vaccine. And in fact, even if you do take that vaccine for another reason, which we'll get to in a minute, you have to object to it. Like, most people, even Catholics, are not even aware that this document actually binds you in that way. Like, if you receive the vaccine, you are supposed to object to it in some way. You need to write the manufacturer, you need to tell your doctor, you need to do, but a lot of these things are not effective. Like, if you tell your doctor, I'm getting this, but I don't really want to get it, like, that's not effective, and so there's a little bit of naivete there in terms of the like, this actually isn't going to stop the problem, but the biggest problem is the argument that's made in favor of getting the vaccine is an argument called remote material cooperation. And this is actually the most difficult argument to parse out in Catholic moral theology and any moral theology, I think. And it's basically like, how far removed do you have to be from the evil in order to not worry about participating in it anymore? And I think the problem with the current thinking within the leadership of the church, and even a lot of the membership of the Catholic Church, is that they understand the word remote incorrectly, because they're thinking temporally remote. So like, this happened 50 years ago, so I'm not involved, and not causally remote, because causally remote is the important part. And I'll give the example with the COVID vaccine in particular, right? So you had an abortion. That's a grave sin. That's to a Catholic, we call that a mortal sin. That's a sin that gets you excommunicated if you participate in abortion or you procure an abortion. So like, you're outside the church. That is like as serious as it gets, in terms of punishment, juridical punishment from the church. So serious sin, right? Now you take the cells from that abortion and you make a cell line. Well, what is that? Well, according to Dignitas Personae, which was published in 2008, which is more official than the previous document I was talking about, because it came out from the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, which was up until this year a binding arm of the magisterium, because Pope Francis rearranged that a little bit. But so they said that the use of any biologically illicit material, and they were speaking specifically of tissue derived from abortions, the use of any biologically illicit material is also a grave sin. Okay, so we have the abortion, which is a grave sin. Then we make the cell line. That's also a grave sin. Okay, now we use that cell line in a pharmaceutical. Well, what is that? Well, we're still using biological material of illicit origin. That's a grave sin. Okay, so we've had the abortion, we've made the cell line, we've made the vaccine. All these things are grave sins. Now you take the vaccine. You are proximate. You are next door to that sin, because it's been sin, 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 sin all the way from the abortion up to the creation of the vaccine. And then you receive it. So that's not remote at all. And that's the thing that people are not, they're not thinking through clearly. because they're not familiar with the information that's in Dignitas Personae. I don't know why nobody's talking about this, because it is the most binding statement that the church has made about bioethics. And then they're not thinking through this remote material cooperation argument. Now, the other part of remote material cooperation, I'm going to talk, there's more parts to it, but I'm going to talk about one other part that's really important. You are only allowed to participate in something evil in a remote material way. So that means it's like you're far enough removed from it causally, and you're not actively willing the evil. So if I was like, yay, abortions, and I got the vaccine, I'm formally participating in it, and that's bad. That I can't do that. So in order to remotely materially participate with evil and that be licit, it has to be a grave circumstance, and the gravity of the circumstance has to be greater than the gravity of the sin, right? So like, if a little kid stole a quarter from his dad, right? That's not a very grave sin. It's still a sin, but it's not like an earth-shattering, like separate you from God level of sin. And then that little kid gave me the quarter to buy a bottle of water when I was in the desert and I was like about to die of dehydration. I can use that quarter to buy a bottle of water, because the fact that I'm going to die and the fact that I'm totally removed from the actual sin that the kid committed, I might not even know about the sin, which changes it to if you're ignorant, you can't sin. So, but the stealing of a quarter is not even remotely commensurate to like dying of dehydration, right? So you have to have something like that, where like if you're going to remotely participate, it has to be far more serious than the sin that was committed. And that's again, this is like the hardest moral problem to explain, and I'm not a moral theologian, so I'm probably not doing a great job. But with the vaccine, in that document, the original document from 2005, that said it was, it didn't say specifically that it was totally immoral for Catholics to participate in using abortifetal vaccines. It said that because we have this very serious situation of congenital rubella syndrome, you can still get an MMR vaccine in order to protect your child and in order to protect any pregnant women in society, because congenital rubella syndrome is so serious. Now, I think that's a faulty moral argument, but explaining exactly why that's a faulty moral argument, I'm glad you agree. But explaining why that's a faulty moral argument, it's going to take a lot more nuance than I'm able to give. But it's also a faulty biological argument, because congenital rubella syndrome incidence was not reduced by rubella vaccination. It only went down in 1973, coincident with Roe versus Wade. So it's not perfectly documented, but it's far more likely that the incidence of congenital rubella syndrome only declined because abortion became legal, and women who were exposed to rubella during their pregnancy were encouraged to abort their children instead of giving birth to their children. The vaccine didn't actually affect congenital rubella syndrome at all. It didn't actually affect herd immunity to rubella at all. We were already at herd immunity to rubella as a population before we started the vaccine. And so I guarantee that no one has ever sat a bishop down and explained that to them. I would like to. I've been invited once to try to, actually twice, to try to get to speak to some of the bishops on the United States Catholic Council of Bishops, but because the bishops are surrounded by the people who deal directly with the bishops, who are surrounded by the people who deal directly with those people, and then I'm like 5 or 6 steps removed from the bishop. My request probably never made it to the bishop because of
Do you
all of
think
the bureaucracy surrounding them.
you think that's the same for the Pope as well? That the Pope is just not familiar with those types of things, or I mean, because like he
Yeah.
has significantly pushed that vaccine.
Yeah, so I cannot make a moral judgment about the state of someone else's soul. So I can't
Yes,
tell you, exactly how culpable Pope Francis is. I can
yes.
tell you that Pope Francis does a lot of things as a human being that are not particularly Catholic. And when you think about the Pope, you have to be very careful about, Catholics understand the Pope to be infallible only when he is speaking ex cathedra. So only when he is saying, by the authority vested in me through the through the church and through the see of St. Peter, and all it has to be a very formal declaration. Something a pope says in an interview is not infallible. Something the pope says, at lunch to his colleague is not infallible. An opinion the pope holds is not infallible. It is only when the pope is actively teaching specifically, in his capacity. So Pope Francis has a lot of opinions that are not particularly orthodox. Unfortunately he is the pope, and we understand from the Old Testament that you get bad leaders when you deserve them. So what we really need to do in this situation is become better Catholics, and we'll merit a better pope. So that's all I'm really willing to say about the pope.
No, I like that because I actually it doesn't do any good to just point out negatives and
Mhm.
or whatever. It's like,
Right.
I believe that God is in control no matter what.
Absolutely.
And so yeah, that's very, very encouraging. These are very interesting things that you've brought up here. I will send you some of that information about
Yes, please do.
the vaccine and papal history and that type of thing. And so yeah. I'm really interested, not just in like what is licit and what is sin necessarily
Mhm.
from the point of a legal
Yeah.
aspect of it, but
Mhm.
also especially because, I really loved how you were drawn to this whole subject of the character of God
Yeah.
and how how what you believe in terms of the science, you know, um, when we believe things according to the Bible and the Bible, what it has to say about the character of God, it all just makes sense, right?
Mhm.
There's that constancy from the Old Testament to the New Testament and all these things. And I really believe that, the Bible, when it says that when Jesus comes, we will be like him, for we shall see him as he is. I feel
Mhm.
like it's a promise for us that even though we have become so degenerate over these 6,000 years that humans have degenerated since Adam and Eve, that despite that degeneracy, God promises us that if we have faith in God's word and we look at him for everything, that we can become like him.
Yeah.
We can have that character of Jesus. We can have that
Yeah.
patience and that faith and that type of thing. And so this is what I'm very interested in as far as Christians uh, accepting the current status quo
Mhm.
of how medicines are being made,
Sure.
how children are kind of being farmed for
Mhm.
the making of medications. And, I think that um, we we Christians, we've been way too complacent. We've been way too accepting. We are the ones asking for the vaccines. We're the ones
Mhm.
asking for the medications. And you know, if you look throughout history, as you were saying, sanitation, hygiene, which are, if you look through the Bible, those are God's ways to bring health. Like to the Israelites, he gave them all these laws about health. And you're seeing that throughout history that God's ways worked,
Mhm.
right? God's ways
Yep.
worked.
Yep. Well,
It's
he
just
designed the
amazing.
body, so
He
it makes
designed the
sense that,
body.
yeah, he would be able to tell us how it works. And just to touch for a second on that the legal distinctions between licit and illicit, right? It has always been the moral teaching of the church that you are never required to participate in sin, or even encouraged to participate in sin. There are only some instances where you can't, if you can't remove yourself from it in a very grave reason, it might be licit, like legally allowed to
Mhm,
participate. But going back to that example where if I buy a bottle of water with a stolen quarter, if I know that quarter's stolen and I'm like, no thanks,
mhm.
then is actually the better thing to do. It's the more perfect thing to do.
Yes.
And it's not required of me. I don't actually have to exercise that level of heroic virtue, but like, why wouldn't you? I mean, if our goal is heaven,
Yes.
right? Our goal is heaven, and how do we get there? We have to work at, we have to practice becoming more and more like Christ. We can't just wake up morning and be like, okay, I'm good, I'm going to heaven. The things that we do matter. And in a certain sense, we can't earn it. We can't earn heaven at all because our Lord earned it for us. But if I'm sitting here and saying, thanks Dad for going to work today, I'm just going to sit here and do video games, and I'm not going to go to school, the college that you're paying for. It doesn't matter if he's paying for my college because I'm not going to classes. I'm just playing the video games. And so we have to have that level of like, I'm not going to do the evil thing because I'm forming my soul. Like that's what the side of heaven is for. I'm getting ready for heaven by responding to graces. Obviously our Lord really is the one getting me ready for heaven, but I have to get up off of my rear end in front of the video games and go to college,
Yes,
to,
yes.
not that I'm actually a huge fan of going to college, but just for the analogy's sake, I have to go to class,
Yeah,
to actually participate and get the degree. I'm not going to get the degree if I just sit and play the video games, even if my dad pays for it.
yeah,
And it's an imperfect analogy, but we're not going to make it to heaven if we're just complacent in our dealings with sin, um, even if our Lord paid the price for us.
yeah.
Because we have to respond to that. We have to act in accordance with grace.
I like to think of it in terms of, we here on this earth, we are getting ready to become citizens of a new earth, and so
Hmm.
that's what the Bible is teaching us. The Bible is teaching us this is what God's citizens are going to look like in a heavenly kingdom. And so,
Hmm.
um,
And be
yeah,
perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect.
perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. We have to love the things that Jesus loves. And,
Hmm.
this is a growth. This is a journey. It's
Yeah.
all of a sudden
Yeah.
you grow up and you're like, oh, this just happened.
Right.
So, this is the thing about, the health message, why these decisions are important. And
Hmm.
I think that when we make decisions according to the correct paradigm, we're less
Hmm.
likely to be deceived. We're less likely to make mistakes,
Absolutely.
because we won't get caught up with just the arguments about science and efficacy and those things. People are like, well, the science changed. And it's like, no, the science didn't change. The science is the same all the way along. It's just that the recounting maybe of that science and the perspective on that science and what was allowed to be shared about the science
Hmm.
changed.
Well, and
And
here's the thing, like if the science changed, why did we believe it in the first place? If the science can change that fast, why are we following the science?
yeah,
So
good
it kind of
question.
cuts them both ways. Like if they want to maintain that the science is that changeable, then like I don't actually have to believe what science says because it's going to turn around and say something different tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah. So have you gotten into GMO foods and that kind of thing since you're so interested in gene modification and that
Yeah,
type?
so I had a strong conversion experience on that as well. um I went from being like, GMO food is great. We're going to save the world. We're going to, give nutritious rice to people in third world countries, and what with golden rice or whatever. And to being like, no, we can't actually mess with these things. We can't, mixing species is just a really bad idea. Because God created every animal to reproduce after its kind,
Mhm.
you know
Yes.
and that doesn't mean that I should put mouse genes into a tuna fish. Like that's not, that was never part of God's plan.
Yeah.
And just because I have the technology to do it doesn't mean it's part of God's plan now, because God doesn't change.
Yeah.
And there are some things that do actually exchange DNA in real life, like bacteria and viruses exchange it a little bit. I think even viruses and the hosts that they're infected with can exchange it a little bit sometimes,
Mhm.
but a mouse and a tuna fish can't exchange DNA naturally. And so that should be a really clear, like easy demarcation of like, okay, well then we don't mix their DNA. But again, if you have this idea that everything is just, flowing out of everything else through DNA, through these genetic mistakes, then you're
And
like,
why
oh, well,
not
there's
take
no,
advantage of it? Why
yeah,
not?
there's no cutoff.
Yeah.
There's everything's all the same anyway.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I am a huge fan of no GMO food. In fact, if there is GMO food in something, I usually won't buy it. Um, and
So is there now, because that evidence for genetic modification, have you been looking into it for evidence for or against and the health outcomes or anything like that?
So, not rigorously, not science, not academically, but anecdotally, yes. So, and it just kind of my own journey, my own health journey, my own experience. There's a lot of different factors that come into it. And one of the things that kind of flagged for me was the rise in celiac disease and gluten intolerance. So uh, Catholics take John chapter 6 literally. When our Lord said, this is my body, when he was holding the host, he meant it. Um, and so if our Lord became bread, there can't actually be anything wrong with bread. Like this just not, it's just completely outside of my ability to even conceive. There could be something just fundamentally wrong with a molecule in bread, even if it is gluten, right? So um because our Lord wouldn't have become, he wouldn't have given us the Holy Eucharist as bread. And that's how we become physically united with him, because then so many people couldn't do it because it's bad for you, so 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 what else is going on? What else is going on? And one of the working theories I had for a long time is it's the fact that all the stuff is so genetically modified. Because a lot of people who go overseas don't have problems eating bread, because they're in Europe or they're in Africa where the grain is just not as contaminated as it is here with GMOs. And also, but then there's also the glyphosate, and not just the glyphosate, but the whole Roundup complex, because
Yeah.
Roundup is not just the sum of its parts, because things work synergistically sometimes, so you actually have to test the whole thing and not just like a part of the thing. And this
Yeah.
is one of the ways where they really mess up vaccine safety studies, because instead of testing the whole vaccine against a saline placebo, they
Yeah.
test the whole vaccine against the whole vaccine minus the antigen. But the antigen isn't the part that we're safety testing. We're safety
Yeah.
testing the whole
The
thing.
whole thing.
Yeah, so that's important. So then there's that. And then another thing that actually I recently became aware of is that, especially for I think there's 30 to 40% of Caucasians carry a mutation in their MTHFR gene. And I don't know how it goes in other ethnicities, but I happen to carry the MTHFR mutation in one spot. You can have it in two different spots they test
I
for. And
have both.
do you really? Okay,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. So it
So
must be, it must
yeah,
be
yeah.
across the different ethnicities.
Um, but that's a lot of people. 30 to 40% is a lot of people, right? And that mutation, whether you're heterozygous for it or homozygous for it, so whether you have two copies or one copy of each possible mutation, you you cannot process synthetic B vitamins correctly. Now, if you were to pick up just any one random box of crackers, bag of bread at the grocery store, you flip it over and you look at the ingredients, it'll say enriched wheat flour. And when you go to the end of that enriched wheat flour list, it'll say folic acid.
Mhm.
Folic acid does not get processed correctly in the bodies of people who have MTHFR mutations, and it causes nerve damage, it causes digestive problems, it causes all kinds of things. And so like how much of the pathology that we're seeing in relation to bread is because we're adding folic acid to it and nobody can process it correctly. So there's all these different things that could be competing, but I know it's not the bread. so so I think it's probably the GMO and the folic acid are my true current, well, and the pesticide. I mean, all of that is going into making
Yeah.
wheat toxic to us, and it shouldn't be. Like people have eaten bread since the beginning of time.
Yeah.
It's
I
never
agree
caused a
with you.
problem.
I think that Satan is working really hard on this whole food thing. We
Mhm.
as Seventh-day Adventists, I look at, Jesus represented the word of God that came down from heaven. And that word, I totally agree with you. That word, it needs to be perfect,
Mhm.
and in Isaiah, do you know that there's this verse, Isaiah 55, verses 2 to 3? I'll send this to you. It says, "Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and
Yes.
your labor for that which does not satisfy?" And
Mhm.
and so I feel like a lot of us are doing that. There's so many things on the grocery store shelves that
They're not
pretend to
food.
be food. It's not food. It's not
Yeah.
real bread, and so
Yeah. No,
yeah,
good wholesome food is from God. And the
yes,
devil the
and
devil can't create, but he can destroy,
yes,
right? And so he couldn't make, and if you think about it, one of the things that, going back to the character of God, like who would create through death? Who
right,
would create through mistakes? Who would
yes,
create through all of this struggle?
yes.
Like it is actually so terrible that people believe that God created this way, because it's in the way that God would create.
Well, it's because there's another force at work wanting us to believe
Hmm.
something. the character of God that isn't true.
Right, right. And the devil can't make food. He couldn't make a Garden of Eden,
Mm-hmm.
but he can destroy food. And I think there is something really diabolical about the GMO movement. I think it is the distortion of our food supply.
Yeah.
Again, if good wholesome food is from God, and you mess with that and you make it less wholesome and less nutritional and more reactive in human bodies, that's not from God, you know.
So I hope that, as our watchers and listeners, as you're taking all of this in, that as you're thinking about making whatever decisions that you're making, that these decisions, they have to be in alignment with your belief system. You can't just say, okay, this is
Yeah.
what I believe, and now I'm going to do this because this is according to
Right.
science. Because then
Right.
it makes your whole belief system something that is just superstitious and just a little bit of magic maybe that we're going to sprinkle on when we ask the Lord to bless our food or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, that was a chemical, and now that it's on my table, I guess the Lord has blessed it and transformed it or something. And so we have to be consistent. I think it's the same thing with the way that we view healthcare. It's like when we allow companies to exploit children and death, and we say, okay, for the sake of saving humanity, children need to die.
No.
That is just human sacrifice. That's paganism.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's
That's exactly
paganism.
what it is.
Paganism that is coming into Christianity because the devil is wanting to confuse people. And that's why you have so many different denominations, so many different belief systems, is because there is some level of blindness, I think, amongst humanity. And, as we see things more and more clearly, I believe we will come into unity. God's children are going to come into unity. And COVID has opened up our eyes to the dark side of
Mm.
so many things that we have just taken for granted, as this is the way that society works, this is the way healthcare works, this is the way the making of medication works. And so there are, all things work together for good for them that love the Lord. And so we can take these unfortunate things and we can take them to Jesus and ask him, what are we supposed to do? Just like you did, Pamela, when you found out about creation and the character of God, and you had to make a decision. What am I going to do with this information?
Mm-hmm.
You
Well,
know?
and I had to pray about it a lot, and a lot of people were praying for me too. And I think that, like, when we look at these things, we're tempted sometimes, especially in America. I think this is part of our culture, to say, well, what's the solution? What can I do? What's the natural, is it an election? Is it a petition, a protest? Is it buying organic at the grocery store? It has to start with prayer.
Yeah.
All of that has to start with prayer, because we're not going to know what we ought to be doing unless we're praying. And unless
Yeah.
we're people of prayer, we're not going to be able to come to the truth, and we're not going to be able to come to knowledge of how we should act. So if you take one thing away from all the things that we've talked about today, just, and you don't know what to do in the world, you pray. You start by praying.
Amen.
You start by praying, and you don't take our word for any of the things that we've said. You pray
Yeah.
and you do your research, and you ask the Lord to guide you, because he will. If you're honest, if you're sincere, if you're seeking the truth, you will find the truth.
Oh, Pamela, and I have to just let our watchers know this, is that we as Seventh-day Adventists, we were told, that these things would happen. And we were told that we need to move to the country. We need to grow our own food. I believe that we as Seventh-day Adventists, if we had been faithful to that light, we would be a light right now when the food supply is is uh, is being threatened, and we would know how to grow food. We would know these things instead of many of us wondering, what are we going to do? How are we going to help ourselves? We would be able to help other people. And so, I just want to encourage us. God has given us a way to take care of ourselves, growing food, to know how to heal using food, using herbs and this type of thing. the way that medications are made, a lot of it has to do with pagan practices. If you look at the history of medicine and this type of thing. And so we need to be able to separate the good from the evil. We need to look at the principles. And most of all, I pray that we would be praying and asking the Lord, how are you going to be glorified? How is the world going to see the character of God? How is that truth going to be revealed to the world? And it is going to be revealed when people have courage to make the right decisions. That's how light shines. Pamela, God's character, I think his light has shined in your life because you had courage to make good decisions. And I know that these were difficult decisions. You really wanted to pursue these career goals. And I'm going to pray and ask the Lord to bless you in your journey and your walk, and you're helping many, many people. And yeah, so thank you very much for being faithful. And
Well, thanks be to God. Thanks be to God for all those things, because I couldn't do it
amen.
without
Yes,
his grace. So
amen, amen. Thank you. So we will close, and I just want to thank everybody for being here. We'll be here again next Sabbath, and God bless you all in your journey with him. And I just pray that you all have been inspired to stand true, to search for truth, and to make sure that God's going to be glorified in your lives.